Hello everyone, welcome to the class. This course is called Introduction to Psychology, and I'm the instructor. My name is Wundt. I'm still excited to introduce you to this fascinating world of psychology. Well, just imagine this. You're on the busy street, watching people hustle and bustle about their day. Then you might have some questions. What are they thinking? And why do they act the way they do? Well, you're not alone. Psychologists have those questions every day as they try to figure out the mysteries of human behaviors. Well, whether you're here just want to learn more about psychology, to prepare for a career in the field, or to explore some new ideas, you are all welcome to this class. I'm sure that you will learn a lot and you will get a better understanding of human mind and human behaviors after taking this course. So now let's get ready and let's get started to learn, to enjoy, and to explore psychology together. So this course is designed to introduce you to the different topics and issues in psychology, including lifespan development, learning, memory, personality, and psychological disorders, and so on. Along the way, you will be able to develop a fundamental knowledge of the psychological research and the theories in the field. And the ultimate goal is for you to apply what you learn in psychology to the real world in order to enrich your academic pursuits, your relationship with your family and friends or peers, and your health physically and mentally, as well as the other aspects in your lives. There are several objectives in this course. So first, after this course, you will be able to acquire the knowledge of psychological research and the important research findings in the field. And next, you will be able to make a connection between the psychological research and your own personal values and goals. And lastly, we hope to foster your enthusiasm and your curiosity for psychology, and hopefully you will appreciate psychology. Before we talk about the course, I would like to introduce a little bit about myself. My name is Wundt, and I'm currently a project associate professor in the Department of Psychology at National Taiwan University in Taipei, Taiwan. Before I came to this school, I got my PhD in developmental psychology from the University of California, Riverside. Then after I graduated, I moved to Missouri, and I worked as an assistant professor and then later associate professor in the Department of Psychology and Counseling at Southeast Missouri State University. Then in year 2021, I moved to Taiwan, and then I work here as a faculty member. Well, it's my great honor to be here to teach this course, Introduction to Psychology Online, so that more people know about psychology. Well, there are different areas in psychology, and I specialize in developmental psychology. I focus on adolescents and emerging adults. My research interests focus on risk-taking behaviors, decision-making, parenting, and culture. So that's about me. This course is structured into 6 modules. So first we have this course introduction, and then we will have the 6 main modules, including Introduction to Psychology, Lifespan Development, Learning and Memory, Sleep, Stress and Health, Personality, and Psychological Disorders. And after the 6 modules, we will have a conclusion module. In terms of grading, after you finish each module, you will have to take a quiz. And the quiz will be multiple choice questions. As you can see, each module is worth 13%. And after the 6th module, you will have the conclusion module, and then you will have to take the peer review assignment, which is 18% of the final course grade. So that is all about the course introduction. And now you can take the course introduction quiz. You will have 15 minutes to complete it. And after you finish the quiz, you can move on to the week 1 module, which is Introduction to Psychology. That is all for this video, and thank you for watching. Hello everyone! So now we're going to start Module 1, which is Introduction to Psychology. Now we're going to have a module introduction. In this module, we're going to look at several things. So first, we will look at the introduction to psychology. And then we will talk about the definition of psychology and the different research areas. And then we will look at the principles in psychology. Those are the things that you need to know when we study psychology. And then next, I will give you an overview of the history of psychology to learn about the big names in psychology and their important theories. And after that, we will go over the different perspectives in psychology. And lastly, we will look at the research methods that are used by psychologists in the field. After we talk about the module, please remember to take the quiz, which is Week 1 quiz. There are several objectives in this course. So after this course, you will be able to define psychology, and you will be able to identify the different research areas in psychology. And then next, we will explore the principles in psychology to know the things that we have to keep in mind when we study this field. And then next, we will look at the history of psychology. So you will be able to trace the historical development of psychology, including the big names in psychology and the different schools of thoughts. And lastly, you will be able to understand the different research methods that are used by psychologists in the field. Next, we're going to look at Introduction to Psychology. What is psychology? Well, do you remember how you interacted with your parents when you were a kid? Then do you believe that your interaction with your parents can influence who you are today? Well, that is psychology, and that is part of developmental psychology. Or have you ever thought about, why am I thinking in this way? How do I learn language? Or how do I process information? How do I remember things? Well, that is psychology, and that is cognitive psychology. Or have you ever had the experience that you have different personalities? Sometimes you're quite outgoing with your friends, but you're quite shy with your relatives. Well, that is psychology, and we will actually have a module to talk about personalities. Or sleep. Sleep is also psychology. We all have to sleep every day. But have you ever thought about why we sleep and how much sleep we need? And sleep is actually one stage of consciousness that we have. Or like this. Maybe sometimes you feel down, you feel sad, you feel that there's no way out, and you feel depressed. Well, that could be a psychological disorder. And that is also psychology. Or maybe like this, you like to be alone. You like to focus on yourself, focus on your breath, and you like to do meditation. You like to think about your future and how you deal with the different life experiences. That is also psychology. So as you can see, psychology is everywhere in our everyday life. Then, what is psychology? Well, psychology is an academic discipline. We know we have Department of Psychology. We have a course like this, Introduction to Psychology. So it's a major study. It's a major subject in universities or colleges. In addition, psychology is a science. Psychologists use scientific methods to study human mind and behaviors. For example, I study risk-taking among adolescents. But how do I study this topic? Well, maybe I can recruit adolescents to a lab, and then I can use a focus group. I can ask them some questions and ask them to talk about why do they engage in those behaviors. Or I can use a survey. I can use an online questionnaire and ask adolescents to report their risk-taking behaviors. So after I gather data, I can do the analysis to support or refute my hypothesis. So we can see that psychology is a science, that we use the scientific methods to collect data and do the analysis. Additionally, psychology is a profession. We want to apply what we learn from the research findings to the real world in order to solve human problems. So it's a profession. In short, psychology is a subject, it's a discipline, it's a science, and it's also a profession. Next, we're going to look at the definition of psychology and the different research areas. We know that psychology is a science and it's a profession, but you may ask, what is psychology exactly? By definition, psychology is the scientific exploration of behavior and human processes. So we want to use the scientific methods to understand human mind and behaviors. So the scope of psychology is to investigate the different levels in order to understand the human behavior. For example, why do we eat? Our eating behavior. So what makes you want to eat? Well, you might think you're hungry. Yes, we eat because we're hungry. It's due to our hormones and it's due to our hypothalamus that can produce the hormones to influence our hunger feeling. But what else? Well, we may want to eat because we smell the food, or maybe we see the picture of the food that looks so delicious. So we can see that there are several factors that may influence our eating behavior. And psychologists try to understand a behavior by looking at the different levels, such as psychological, biological, and social levels underlying the behavior. Then next, there are some goals of psychology. So first, describe. Psychologists describe a phenomenon. For instance, like father, like son. That's something that we can observe in our daily life. So you might think that you're like your parents. You can describe this. And then next, interpret. So we try to interpret this phenomenon. You might think, I'm like my parents. Our personality are alike. Our behaviors are quite similar. Then next, we make a prediction. We state some hypotheses. We might think, yes, I'm like my parents. Maybe it's because we're genetically related. Or maybe it's because I observe my parents' behaviors and that's why I learn from them. And after we make the prediction, we can state some hypotheses and conduct a study to test our hypothesis. The process to test this hypothesis might be complicated, but to put it simply, we can have two groups. We can have birth parents and their children, and then in the second group, we can have parents and adopted children. Then we can look at how similar they are in their behaviors or in their personality. So in the first group, they're genetically related. And in the second group, they share the environment. So then we can compare the two groups and make a conclusion whether their behaviors are due to their genes or due to the environment. And after we gather the information from our research findings, we can apply it to the real world in order to support a hypothesis and form a theory. So those are the goals of psychology. Then what are the examples that psychologists focus on? Well, first, rearing children. So how parents treat their children and how parents interact with their children can influence how children become. That is psychology. Or like this, stress management. How do you deal with stress? And how can you manage stress effectively in order to have a healthy life? That is also what psychologists care about. Social media impact. Well, how do social media can influence adolescents' self-esteem or life satisfaction? That is also what psychologists are interested in. Or like this, emotional reactions. Well, you might be wondering how you react to different situations emotionally, and how do you manage your negative emotions? That is also psychology. Or you might be thinking about how advertising might influence how likely you buy the products. That is also psychology. So we can see that there are tons of examples that psychologists focus on. So once again, psychology is everywhere in our everyday life. There are so many research areas in psychology. As you can see, first, developmental psychology. Well, developmental psychologists study change over time. So they look at the trajectory from babies, children, adolescents, adults to death. They look at the trajectory of changes over time. Or social psychology. People in this area study how interactions with people or how the environment might influence our behaviors or attitudes. In educational psychology, researchers focus on curriculum design or teaching training, and they also focus on how to provide better quality of education. Then in health psychology, researchers focus more on how our psychological factors might influence our physical health. Then in personality psychology, we study the different personality traits. We want to know why people have different personalities, and some researchers might design some measures to assess our personality. Then in experimental psychology, researchers conduct experiments to test the hypothesis. They may have two groups, they have control group and experimental group, and then they can compare whether there are differences in the two groups in their behaviors. And then next, in cognitive psychology, we look at our brain. We look at how we process information, how we learn language, and how we remember things. Next, in psychometrics, researchers try to design some scales to measure the different traits or different dimensions, such as our IQ or our depression. Then in physiological psychology, researchers might use animals. They use animal models to do the manipulation of the brains of the animals to try to understand the mechanisms underlying behaviors. Then next, in clinical psychology, researchers focus more on the treatment and therapy, also the symptoms of the psychological disorders. And then in counseling psychology, researchers focus more on how to deal with the everyday problems and how to provide therapy and treatment for individuals with the everyday problems. And as you can see on the screen, there are a lot of areas in psychology, and I'm not going to talk about them all in detail. So you can see that psychology is everywhere. And next, we're going to look at the principles in psychology. And these are the things that we have to keep in mind when we study psychology. Well, first, psychology is empirical. What does that mean? That is, we have to provide evidence, we have to provide proof to show that we can support our hypothesis. So we say psychology is empirical. We have to provide empirical evidences. Then next, in psychology, there are several theories. And to form a theory, we have to test all the possible hypotheses. So it's very difficult to form a theory in psychology. And next, well, when we study human behaviors, we should also take into consideration the society and the historical context. Well, for instance, if we want to study how social media, such as Instagram or Facebook, might influence adolescent self-esteem, then we should know that it's a topic that we are not able to study 30 years ago. So we should always take into consideration the society and also the historical context when we study human behaviors. And next, well, we should know that a single behavior is caused by multiple causes. For example, why are some people willing to do bungee jumping? Well, it could be that they want to have fun, they are sensation-seeking people, or maybe it's because it's on their bucket list. They don't want to do it, but they have to do it before they die. Or maybe it's because their parents don't allow them to do it, but they want to do something to challenge their parents. So we can see that a single behavior is caused by a lot of different factors, and we should know that when we study behaviors, we should examine those different factors. Next, when we study a behavior, it's always important to look at the culture. For instance, maybe in some culture, we think that eating dogs is not normal, but in some other cultures, it's totally normal. So when we examine the behavior, it's important to look at the cultural background. And the next important issue is nature and nurture. Nature and nurture are the genes and the environment, and both are important. Now researchers generally agree that it's the interaction of our genes and environment that contributes to our personality and our behaviors. Then next, we should know that our experience of the world is highly subjective. We all have different viewpoints and different perspectives. However, for psychologists, they try to make their observations as objective as possible so that they can test their hypothesis. So these are the principles in psychology, and these are the things that we have to keep in mind when we study human behaviors. Next, we're going to look at the history of psychology. And here I'm going to give you an overview of what happened before in the past. So first, in the beginning of psychology, we have to talk about this guy, Wilhelm Wundt. Well, he was called the father of psychology because he established the first lab in psychology, and he also created the first journal in psychological research. That's why he was called the father of psychology. Additionally, he proposed the school of structuralism. So what is that? That is, we can break our consciousness into the basic elements to examine. And Wundt proposed the term introspection, which means the systematic observation of our own personal experiences. So we can use this introspection to understand our consciousness. Then later, William James. William James was Wundt's student, but he had a different view. So he believed that, well, if we want to study our mind, we should look at the purpose and the function of the mind, instead of breaking our mind into several basic elements. So he proposed the school of functionalism. But what's the difference between the two? Now let's look at the difference between structuralism and functionalism. In terms of structuralism, Wundt believed that we can break our mind or break our consciousness into basic elements. So for example, our experiences can be broken down into sensation and perception. For instance, we can see, we can hear, we can smell, we can touch. And so those are the sensations. And we can also have perceptions. When we see, we can perceive it as bright. And when we smell, we can perceive it as something tasty. So we can have sensations and perceptions. We can break our consciousness into those elements. And these elements can combine together to form our experience by using introspection. Well, for functionalism, it's different. William James believed that we should look at the function or purpose of the mind, and it's related to our survival. It's related to our natural selection. which is related to Darwin's theory. But you may still be curious about the difference between structuralism and functionalism. So now we're going to do an activity together to learn more about structuralism. Now I'm going to show you some pictures, and please think about what you perceive. So you can use some words to describe your perception. So, are you ready? Now let's look at the first one. What do you perceive? You might think, oh, it's fast, it's scary, or it's exciting. Those might be your perceptions. How about this? What do you perceive? Maybe you think it's huge, it's brown, or it's scary, or it's cute. Those might be the perceptions that you may have. How about this? What do you perceive? Adorable, innocent, little? Those might be your perceptions. Or like this. What do you perceive in this picture? Green, creepy. How about this? The last one. What do you perceive? You might think it's comfortable, it's soft, it's clean. Well, that is structuralism. So when we look at the picture, we analyze the contents of the picture. Like this one, we might see the bed, the pillows. Oh, the pillows look so fluffy, so they must be comfortable. They're soft. And the sheet is white, it's so clean. So we break our experiences into elements, and those elements form our consciousness. That is structuralism. But we said functionalism is different. Let's look at this picture. When you see a bear, what would you do? Would you run away or would you hug the bear? Well, I'm sure that most of us will run away. And why? That is due to natural selection. We want to survive. That's why when we see the bear, we will run away. So according to functionalism, we look at the bigger picture. We do not analyze the ears, the eyes, or the teeth of the bear. We look at the big picture and we know that we have to run away because we want to survive. So now we can see the difference between structuralism and functionalism. Now we're going to look at the early history of psychology. I'm going to introduce some of the big names in the history. Well, there are a lot of psychologists in the field, and here I'm only going to point out some of them because we're going to look at them again in the following modules, and also they have contributed a lot to the field. So let's look at the first psychologist, Freud. I'm sure that many of you have heard of Freud before. Well, Freud proposed psychoanalytic approach. There are several terms that he mentioned, such as id, ego, and superego. He also proposed that we have the unconscious mind. He believed that we have some unwanted thoughts and feelings or wishes that we don't want to deal with. That's why we put them out of our awareness into our unconscious part. And Freud also believed that we can look at our free association, our dream analysis to better understand our unconscious part. So that's about Freud. And we will talk more about Freud in the personality chapter. Next, let's look at Watson. Well, Watson was the father of behaviorism because he believed that in order for psychology to be a true science, we should only study what can be measured and what can be observed. So we should not focus on the unconscious part. We should look at what can be measured. That's why it's called behaviorism. Behaviorism became quite popular at that time. However, Watson left the academic world later, and then he became quite successful in the field of advertising. Next, let's look at B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner proposed several terms to better understand how we learn things. For example, he believed that we can learn from reinforcement. If we do something and then get a positive reward, something we like, then we will repeat the behavior in the future. However, if we do something wrong, like if we cheat on the exam and then we get a 0, that's like a punishment. Then we probably won't do that again in the future. So we are influenced by the consequences of our behaviors, such as reinforcement and punishments, and that is how we learn things. So those are the terms proposed by B.F. Skinner. Next, let's look at Carl Rogers. He proposed the humanistic approach, and he believed that we are all good. We all have the potential to fulfill our full potential. So we all have the potential for personal growth. And along with Maslow, they believe that we can all be the best we can be. That is humanistic approach. And again, we will talk more about the humanistic approach in the personality chapter. Now we're going to look at the different perspectives in psychology. So first, let's look at psychoanalytic perspective. And we have mentioned this earlier. Freud was the founder of psychoanalytic perspective. He believed that our childhood memories are very important and can influence our personality, influence our behaviors, and influence who we are today. And our unconscious part is also important. Our unconscious part includes a lot of our unwanted wishes and thoughts that can influence who we are. And Freud also proposed some terms such as ego and superego, including our immediate gratification, or ego, which deals with the reality, and our morality, our superego. And we will talk more about them in the following module. Freud also proposed the psychosexual stage theory, that he believed that we will have the fixation at the stages, so that could influence our personality. That is the psychoanalytic perspective. And next, let's look at the behavioral perspective. It's from 1913 to now. In this perspective, researchers focus on the observable behavior. Like what we said earlier, Wilson believed that if we want the psychology to be the true science, we should only study what can be measured. And so B.F. Skinner and Pavlov, they also studied the observable behaviors. For example, Pavlov conducted studies with the dogs. He was interested in learning about the dog's digestive system. And then he found the classical conditioning that we can associate the stimuli together, and then the neutral stimulus can trigger the response. And we will talk more about that later. And so in this perspective, we study the behavior that can be measured, so then we can provide evidence to support our hypothesis. That is the behavioral perspective. Next, we're going to look at humanistic approach, and it's from 1950 to present. In this approach, researchers believe that we are all good, and we can all fulfill our full potential. For example, Maslow proposed the hierarchy of needs, which means that our needs are arranged in the hierarchy, and we work from the bottom to the top. So if we fulfill the bottom needs, then we can move on to the next level of needs. And at the top, that's self-actualization. And we can all reach the top because we all have that potential. So that is humanistic approach, that we all have the potential for personal growth. Next, we're going to look at cognitive perspective. It's also from 1950 to now. In this perspective, we focus more on information processing. They believe that our brain is just like a computer. We can key in the data, encode the information, we can save the information in our brain, and then we can retrieve the information for later use. So it's just like a computer. But our brain is actually far more complicated than a computer. From this view, how we retrieve information, how we store the information are important. And they also focus on how we remember things, how we learn language, and how we solve problems. Those are the topics that cognitive psychologists are interested in. Then next, let's look at biological perspective. It's also from 1950 to now. In this perspective, we focus more on our brain structures. What are the brain structures that are responsible for different types of behaviors? And they also look at neurotransmitters, how they function to influence human mind and behaviors. So from this view, we can see that it's more related to neuroscience today. So it's a different view, different perspective from the perspectives that we mentioned earlier. The next perspective we're going to look at is evolutionary perspective. It's from 1980s to now. This perspective is related to Darwin's theory that I'm sure that many of you have learned in high school. So this theory focuses more on natural selection. We want to survive, so we do some behavior. And if we survive, those traits, those genes can be passed on to the next generation. So they look at our behaviors from this perspective to explain why do we have certain behaviors. So that is evolutionary perspective to explain human behaviors. The next approach we're going to look at is cultural perspective. It's from 1980s to now. In this view, psychologists want to know the cultural differences as well as the cultural similarities. That's why they think that culture is important to be taken into consideration when we examine behaviors. For example, in the individualistic culture, people might emphasize independence and autonomy, while for individuals in the collectivistic culture, they might emphasize group harmony and family cohesion. So we can see that behaviors might be interpreted differently in different cultures due to the different cultural values. That's why it's important to look at culture when we examine behavior, and that is the cultural perspective. The next approach we're going to look at is positive psychology. Let's look at this glass. What do you think? Do you think it's half full or half empty? Well, there's no correct answer, but if you think that it's half full, then you're more towards positive psychology. Well, in positive psychology, researchers focus more on the positive sides of human beings. Well, we know in the past, psychology studies what's wrong with people. They study sadness or depression. But then later, the researcher called Martin Seligman, he believed that, well, we should turn away from the predominant thought of this flow. We should focus more on the positive sides, such as strengths of human beings. We should look at the positive emotions, such as happiness or gratitude. So that is positive psychology. And this movement quickly moved to several areas around the world. So that's another approach to study human behaviors, which is positive psychology. So these are the different perspectives in psychology and the history that are very important to keep in mind. The last part in this module will be research methods in psychology. We know that psychology is a science. Psychologists use scientific methods to study human mind and behaviors. But what are the psychological methods that researchers use? Well, first, let's look at experimental research. In experiments, researchers conduct study by using variables. They may manipulate one variable, which is called independent variable, the IV, and then look at the dependent variable, which is the DV. So they want to look at if there are any changes in the DV due to the manipulation of the IV, and that is an experiment. Usually in the experiment, we may have different groups to compare. For example, if we want to test the effects of a new drug on adolescents' aggressive behavior, then we may have two groups. We give the new drug to the first group of adolescents, that is the experimental group. And in the second group, the control group, we give them the vitamin, the placebo. And then 1 month later, we look at their aggressive behavior. So in this example, the IV, the thing we manipulate, is the new drug. And the DV, The outcome we measure is the aggressive behavior in adolescents. So then, are there any advantages or disadvantages by using experimental design? Well, in terms of advantages, we know that in experiments, we control the variables, we manipulate the IV, and we observe the DV. So everything is under carefully control, and that's why we can draw the causal conclusion. We can know which variable is the cause and which variable is the effect. That is the advantage of using experiments. In addition, well, there could also be some limitations of using experimental design. For example, well, it's in the lab, so it's artificial. It's not the real world. If we want to draw a conclusion and generalize the conclusion from our sample to the real world, that could be a problem. So that is one of the limitations. In addition, sometimes due to some practical issues or ethical concerns, we are not able to conduct an experiment. For instance, if we want to study the topic, such as how nutrition might influence babies' intelligence, then can we have two groups of baby and we give nutrition to the first group and we give nothing to the second group of the baby? No, we cannot do that. So due to practical issue and ethical concern, in this case, we cannot manipulate nutrition. We cannot do an experiment. So those are the disadvantages of using experiments. Then if we're not able to conduct an experiment, what can we do? Well, we can use a correlational research. In correlational research, we do not manipulate variables, but we can observe, or we can use questionnaires, we use survey to collect the information we want. Like the example I mentioned earlier. Or like another example, if we want to examine children growing up in this big city versus children growing up in the rural area, well, we cannot manipulate the place they live. However, we can observe children growing up in the different places, and then we can give them questionnaire to ask them to report their behaviors, and that will be a correlational research. Then what are the advantages and disadvantages of using a correlational research? Well, the advantages are, well, it's natural. We don't manipulate the variables, so we can observe what occurs naturally. And also, it's more flexible. And because we don't manipulate the variables, it's less artificial than in a lab. But what are the disadvantages? Well, we cannot know the causal relationship. Because we don't manipulate the variables, we don't control anything. We are not able to tell the cause and the effect among the variables. And also, we are not able to rule out the confounds. What is a confound? A confound is a variable, it's like a third variable that might influence the results. So it could be a variable that is correlated with both the IV and the DV. But in the correlational research, we don't control the variables. That's why we're not able to rule out the possible confound. That is the possible disadvantage. Next, let's look at qualitative research. Qualitative research is different from quantitative. So quantitative research means that we use survey to collect numbers. But in qualitative research, we collect words. We ask participants to describe their world in their own words. So for example, we can use focus group, we can use naturalistic observation, or we can use case study. So for example, in case study, we might follow a person with depression, and then we can know the detail of the person. We can know the whole story of the person with depression. We can examine the person's interaction with others. We can examine the person's history of the other types of psychological disorder. And we can also look at how depression might influence the person's academic performance, daily functioning, and the other areas in the person's life. So we are able to describe and examine the person thoroughly. That's a case study. But what are the advantages? Well, we can understand the person in detail, or like naturalistic observation, we don't manipulate anything. We just observe, so it's natural, and it's not that artificial as in experiments. And also it's quite flexible. We can always change our hypothesis due to the ongoing process or ongoing observations that we have. However, there are also some limitations. Well, due to the limited sample size, like in case study, we might only have one person or a small group of participants. Then when we draw conclusion from this sample back to the population, it could be a problem. Is it representative enough? Can we say that all people with depression all have the same behaviors? Maybe no. So that could be a limitation. And also, it could be quite subjective. We know in naturalistic observation, maybe I think, oh, the person is happy. But for the second observer, for the second researcher, they might think, no, the person is not happy. So our interpretation of the person's emotions might be quite subjective. And that could also be biased. That could also be the limitation of using the case study or using naturalistic observation. So those are the advantages and disadvantages of using qualitative study. So these are the common research methods that psychologists use in the field. That is all for this module. And now you can take the week 1 quiz. You will have 30 minutes to complete the quiz. And after the quiz, you can move on to the second module. And in the second module, we are going to look at lifespan development. That is all for this video, and thank you for watching.